So, let's talk about Wandavision. Now, this is something that has already been talked about to death on the internet. Everyone's given their opinion about this, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if I have anything new or particularly insightful to say about this TV show. However, I have several years ago decided that just as an intellectual exercise, I'm going to try and review all the movies and TV shows I see. So I'm going to attempt to give my 2 cents on this one, not that I necessarily have anything that's all that insightful to say about this. But, yeah, I guess the first thing to note, which everybody else has already noted, is the production values on this are quite high. It seems like something of movie quality that was just released as a miniseries instead. Now, okay, I guess now that I think about it, the special effects budget or the action scenes or stuff like that, because of the nature of the story, wasn't quite as high, but the cinematography did seem to be like it was something that could have been released in theaters. I mean, I don't know. I'm a bit of an amateur when it comes to judging cinematography. But it looked very high quality to me. And these other, judging by the previews, the other things that are coming through the pipeline, the Loki TV show or the Winter Soldier and Falcon TV show, those previews all look like they're quite high quality. So it appears that we may be entering a new era in terms of the level of quality of TV show that is released on these streaming services. Excuse me, by the way. So, yeah, that should be interesting to see what Disney ends up doing with these future things that are coming down the pipeline through Disney+. But based on the looks we've been getting so far, and based on the quality of WandaVision, it looks like we could be getting some very interesting stuff coming through, and maybe some interesting developments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because it looks like going forward, there's going to be these TV shows are going to be a lot more tightly tied to the movies, which was not necessarily the case before. I didn't really watch any of those shows before, but my understanding was that as the years went on, the old Netflix shows, the ties between them and the Marvel Cinematic Universe became less. But here it looks like it might be a lot more tightly tied together, and a lot maybe of the plot going forward in the Marvel Cinematic Universe may be driven forward by some of these TV shows. Or I mean, it's not even really a TV show, is it? Really, it's more of like a mini series of cinematic quality almost. The other thing to note is that this was a very ambitious project, and I mean that artistically, in the sense that you saw these commercials and you're like, okay, it's Wanda and Vision, and Vision is already dead tragically, and now they're in some sort of comedy sitcom? What is this? I mean, right? Remember when we all saw those previews and we were thinking, I don't know, it looks a bit bizarre, but then the previews kept coming and you thought to yourself, okay, well, this looks like it could be kind of cool in a bizarre way, or it looks intriguing, or I'd like to check it out, whatever it is. But probably still going in with a lot of skepticism about whether Marvel could really pull this off. And that, I think, has been the story of Marvel all along, right? They've always had all these ambitious projects or movies coming through, right? I mean, remember all the skepticism before Avengers came out? People were like, can they really make a movie, a coherent movie with all these different superheroes in it? And then Captain America Civil War, they were like, that sounds a little bit like a far-fetched premise. Can they really make a whole movie out of the superheroes fighting each other? And then, there was that Thor Ragnarok, and the Guardians of the Galaxy, right? I mean, all these things have become so successful. It's almost easy to forget in retrospect that when they came out, when each of these came out, they seemed a bit bizarre at the time, and there was a bit of skepticism about whether or not they could really be pulled off as coherent movies. And yeah, Marvel keeps pulling them off every time. I mean, they're not, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're not solid 10 out of 10s. They're not high art necessarily, but they're good solid 7 or 8s in my book, most of this stuff. And WandaVision as well. I'd say, you know, this isn't a 10 out of 10. It's got a few problems we'll get to later. It's not maybe quite as clever as the creators want it to be, but it's solid. It's watchable. It does what it needs to do. It's a solid 7 or an 8. So they pull it off more or less, and it's just another way that these creators over at the Marvel Cinematic Universe are finding very inventive ways to keep their projects fresh. Because of course there's a big danger when you're dealing with superhero movies, which is perhaps an inherently limiting medium, or at least it could be if you were lazy about it. There is a real danger that it could just turn out to be more of the same, you know. And for the most part, it hasn't been. They've been doing some really inventive, creative stuff over there. And yeah, WandaVision's another one of those things where you're like, okay, are they going to pull this off? And then you're like, yeah, they pulled it off, more or less. So the things WandaVision... Oh, by the way, spoilers. I'm going to get into spoilers and plot points. But the things that they're trying to do, right from the first episode, they're trying to hit several levels at once. It's trying to be, one, a recreation of the old sitcoms from the 1960s, 50s and 60s, and then later 70s and 80s. So it's trying to recreate that sitcom where at the same time creating a mystery about who Wanda and Vision are, or why this is all going on, what's going on. So recreate a sitcom with a little bit of mystery in it. Also being clever homage to TV shows of eras gone past. So as you're enjoying the sitcom and the mystery, or also kind of the nostalgia for old TV, and moving the plot lines of the Marvel Cinematic Universe forward, you know, introducing new characters and tie-ins from other movies, and of course another superhero movie where there is a bad guy at the end who needs to be defeated. So you've got all of these things, and they work more or less. I mean, let's go down the list here. The sitcom element to it, I think it works more as an homage than it does as an actual sitcom. So for example, those first 2 episodes, you get a very strong Dick Van Dyke vibe, and you get a very strong Bewitched vibe from those 2 episodes. And then of course later in the TV show you find out, later in the WandaVision series, you find out that that was not an accident. Something I was going to criticize, or I was thinking about criticizing when I first started watching this show, is I thought, okay, you know, it's clever, but it's not really capturing the aesthetics of 1950s TV. It's just going after Bewitched specifically, or it's not capturing the aesthetics of early 1960s TV. It's just Dick Van Dyke and Bewitched, and it's kind of ignoring all the other shows that were around at that time. And I had that in mind as a criticism, although later on in the series we find out that Wanda was influenced by specific TV shows only. So she was a big Dick Van Dyke fan, she was a big Bewitched fan, she was a big Malcolm in the Middle fan. And so the aesthetics of those TV shows specifically, and maybe less the aesthetics of the era generally. Of course, we didn't know that with those first few episodes. I think the assumption, the speculation on the internet was that it was supposed to be a recreation of the aesthetic of that era generally. But whatever. I think maybe the point I want to make with this is that if you watch Bewitched, or if you watch Dick Van Dyke's show, there is a charm to it. I mean, they're dated now, of course. And I should throw in the caveat that I haven't seen them in years, either of them. But I used to watch them back in the 90s when they were rerun on Nickelodeon and Nick at Night. And certainly my memory of them is that they were fun to watch. They were charming. The acting was good. The humor has changed over the years, but it was still kind of funny. I think I recall the Dick Van Dyke Show in particular had some genuine laughs in it. Bewitched was maybe you were more intrigued by the situation. But the Dick Van Dyke Show could be genuinely funny at times. The Wandavision show is attempting to do several things at once, but one of the things it's attempting to do is recreate the charm and the humor of the Dick Van Dyke Show and the Bewitched show, and I'm not sure they've done that. They haven't done that. So those first 3 episodes, where you're kind of you're stewing in the mystery a little bit. You're kind of wondering what's happening. You're waiting for the plot to kick off. And you're trying to get immersed into the atmosphere of the sitcoms. And I don't think you can get fully immersed in it. I think you feel like you're watching an imitation of the Dick Van Dyke Show, but not without the charm of the Dick Van Dyke Show. And that, at least to me, caused those first few episodes to drag a little bit. I mean, I appreciated what they were doing. I appreciated the atmosphere, etc. But after a while, you're like, okay, especially by episode 3, you're like, all right, I'm a little bit over this kind of trip through TV land. It's not quite as clever as the writers think it is. They're not pulling off the charm of these old TV shows as much as they think they are. And I'm ready for kind of the plot to kick in. But then sure enough, the end of episode 3 is where the plot kicks in. And then episode 4, we get into the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe. Starting with a flashback, I believe it was in episode 4, to what's her name? I forgot the name, sorry, the danger of doing this unscripted, but the character coming back from the blip. Now, one of the criticisms I made way back in my Spider-Man Far From Home review is that they played off the blip like it was a joke. Like the high school students being upset that they had to repeat the year even though they were halfway through it, and all the high school awkwardness about people having aged differently. It was mostly played off as a joke. And I thought to myself, they're kind of, they had this big dramatic thing with this blip, and they're kind of now throwing that away by just treating it as an offhand joke. But then in the same review, I believe, I said, but it's still, they can still come back and do it seriously later. Because to a certain extent, maybe a high schooler would really be upset about having to repeat the year. Like maybe that would be the worst part of it for a high schooler. And they could still go back and explore all the disruption that was caused in people's lives in a later movie or TV show, as it turns out. And episode 4, I believe it was episode 4, gave us some hint of maybe the more serious drama or trauma that some of these characters were suffering by just blinking out for 5 years. It was a short scene, but it was a very intense scene, showing all that chaos in the hospital as all these people suddenly came back and had no idea that they'd missed the last 5 years and were trying to find the loved ones that they were in the hospital with 5 years ago. So that was a a nice moment for the writers to go back and actually explore what actually happened and another side of that blip, or the return from the blip. And then you've got a character whose name I forgot again. It'll come back to me later, sorry. Who's apparently from the Captain Marvel movie, although the Captain Marvel movie is one of the only Marvel Cinematic Universe movies I haven't seen. That and Doctor Strange. I've got to catch up on these one of these days. But then you had Darcy from the Thor movies, who's been absent from the cinematic universe, Marvel Cinematic Universe, for quite some time, since Thor 2. And she was never really, I think, a fan favorite. Character was lukewarm with fans, but I didn't particularly hate her. So it was just nice to see her back. Nice to see that, that they haven't completely forgotten about some of their old characters. And then Randall Park, whose character is named Jim Woo, I think, from the Ant-Man movies. And Randall Park is a very funny guy, but I hope I'm remembering the names right. But yeah, the guy who plays the FBI agent in the Ant-Man movies. He's a very funny guy with a lot of charisma, and was being really underutilized in those Ant-Man movies. So it's good that he's got a much bigger role here. Now, of course, having brought in other characters from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of course you have to ask the question, well, where were the Avengers? Or where was Captain Marvel? Or where was Thor? Or, like, where were all these other characters? Actually, a lot of them are accounted for, aren't they? Having said that, Thor's out in space now with the Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know what Hulk is doing. But, point being, I guess. Oh, okay, admittedly, a lot of them are accounted for. But this is a question that I think people have been asking and will always be asking with a standalone movie or TV show. Well, where's everybody else? Now, I was a comic book geek in my youth. I read DC Comics. I didn't read Marvel Comics, but I think the same principle applies. When you're reading when you're reading a Batman comic book, every issue, Batman is facing down some huge villain who could destroy the world. Okay, not every issue, but like in a lot of issues, because they always have to keep the stakes very high. And sometimes he does crossovers with other superheroes because they're all in the same universe. But sometimes he doesn't, and when you're reading these comic books, it's no good asking yourself, well, where was Superman? Well, why didn't Superman swoop in and save the day here, even when Batman was clearly in over his head? You just have to accept that if the other superheroes don't come in, which, they don't do most of the time, those crossovers are more of events, it was because they were busy doing something else. So this is something I learned from my youth reading comic books, is when Batman has his own solo comic book, you just assume all the other superheroes are busy and they can't help him. And that's why Batman has to, fight Bane, even though Bane was much stronger than he was. And Superman could have easily solved that problem. You just assume Superman was busy. So I think it's a similar thing with these Marvel Cinematic Universes. You just have to assume the other superheroes are busy and not think too much about it. So you have 3 humans from the Marvel Cinematic Universe who have been tied in here. But the other superheroes must be busy doing something else. Actually, let me back up a little bit here and talk about... I mentioned that in my youth, I read DC comic books and I didn't read Marvel comic books. Although I'm vaguely familiar with some of the stuff which I've picked up on the internet, etc. Being a geek who spends way too much time on the internet. So I'm vaguely familiar that there was a plot line called, I believe it was called House of M, in which the Scarlet Witch, Wanda's character, recreated reality. And I believe it was also because of grief in this case. So it's a power that it comes from the comics, and maybe even a plot line that comes from the comics. Her reacting in grief and kind of recreating the reality around her to do that. That being said, though, even though it is something that is inherited from the comics, it's, I think, a very dangerous power to give one of your characters. Because now that you've shown that she can create life, and she's got a piece of the Infinity Stone inside her, and she can create all these things and control all these minds and do all this stuff, it does beg the question of, well, first of all, where was this before? I guess the answer to that question was you just have to assume that she hadn't developed it in herself yet. But then the other problem area is, okay, going forward, now that you've essentially said this character has near infinite godlike powers, that means the next threat that the Avengers face has the potential to be quite boring, because you're like, well, the Scarlet Witch could just solve this by just using her infinite magic and recreating reality, or I don't know. It's a problem, and the end of the the end of the TV series seems to be setting her up to be even more powerful yet. So where all that's going is going to be interesting to see. If she rejoins the Avengers roster, then she's going to be way too powerful for them to do interesting storylines. But if she moves into more of an antagonist role, or more of a problem to be solved role in the future movies, then maybe that could be interesting. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what they do with it. I've got some reservations about how powerful they've made her. Sorry, I'm jumping all over here from random point to random point as I think about what I want to talk about. How much time do I have left? Okay, I've got about 8 minutes before this camera shuts itself off. But another random point that occurs to me that I wanted to talk about somewhere here is the whole concept of her recreating sitcoms is a little bit silly, isn't it? I mean, I know that they tried to explain that away with her being brought up by the sitcoms and having wanting to go back to this happy time that she remembered with her family. But yeah, it works in the sense that we, the viewers, decide, we the viewers know what we're in for kind of from episode 1, and even before episode 1, because we've seen the previews and we've seen the blurbs, and we know that this is going to be some sort of crazy sitcom thing. Where Wanda and Vision are somehow living through sitcoms from different eras. And we as a viewer get on board with that to a certain extent and say, okay, well, let's see where this goes. And we know, of course, I think most of us had a strong suspicion that it wasn't really a 1950s or 1960s sitcom, that there was something about bending reality behind it. So then when we found out that it was Wanda herself who was creating the sitcom and creating the broadcast, because we had already signed up for this premise, I think we gave this a lot of space, or at least I did. And, once you're immersed in the whole thing, you're immersed in the whole thing. But it is the kind of thing where if you sit back carefully and think about it, you're like, all right, this is kind of ridiculous that she would recreate. I could understand the fact that she would recreate this fantasy world that she would want to live in, but that she would recreate this whole sitcom complete with commercials and broadcast it out for other people to see, broadcast it out on a signal that was specific to the TVs of the era. All were supposedly kind of really not exactly knowing what she was doing. Okay. I mean, even granted that she has these infinite powers, it's a little bit of a silly. It's a little bit of a silly thing. It doesn't entirely all make sense. But then, of course, you knew that from the get-go. From episode 1, you knew that this whole thing was going to be a little bit of a silly premise. So I gave that a bit of space. And I suspect other people did too in order to get on board with it. And then, of course, you had the Pietro, the Quicksilver guy, who was the actor who had been playing Quicksilver in the X-Men movies over at Fox. And then when he showed up, there was that big speculation that, okay, they're bringing in the multiverse. Because why not? They've got all the rights to these characters. I was skeptical, actually, that they were really going to bring in the multiverse from day one. Because I thought that seemed a little bit too cheesy, even for Marvel. Sorry, I shouldn't say even for Marvel. Marvel's done a very good job of kind of keeping the tone consistent in their universe. Is that what I want to say? I mean, they have had some silly movies and some serious movies, but keeping the universe as a whole that you can get immersed in. And I thought, okay, they're not going to jump in and try and bring in the X-Men from the X-Men movies. That would just kind of muck up the careful storytelling that they've been trying to do over at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But it did, of course, lead to a lot of speculation about what was really going on here, and was there a multiverse, and were the X-Men, was this going to be the back door in which the X-Men come in? And then, of course, it turned out that no, it was essentially the production company, the directors and the producers trolling us by introducing a character that they knew, an actor that they knew would make us think that they're bringing in the multiverse. And some people were a little bit upset by that. I wasn't really upset by it, although I do think all that speculation is a little bit dangerous because it takes you out of the TV show. So when you're watching him, you're no longer thinking, okay, he's a character and I'm going to see how he develops. You're thinking about all these fan theories or you're thinking about the whole history of the intellectual property rights to the X-Men while you're watching it, and that's preventing you from getting more immersed in the story. Anytime your memory of the copyright battles between these characters is becoming more important than the story, that's a little bit of a dangerous move, and it maybe does take you out a bit. But I don't think it was terrible. I think it worked within the story that they wanted to tell. And then, of course, you find out that it was Agatha all along in episode... What episode was that? 7. And then there was that big battle in episode 9. And I've heard a couple other people say that they felt that battle at the end was boring. And I was a little bit relieved to hear other people say that, because I had been thinking maybe that was just me. Like, oh, okay, maybe I'm just getting too old for these superhero movies, or... maybe I'm just getting a little bit old and jaded, or these action scenes don't excite me as much as they used to when I was younger. And maybe all of that's true as well. But hearing other people say, I've listened to a couple of the reviewers who said that that action scene at the end was the most boring thing about it, and I thought, yeah, okay, I'm glad that's not just me then. You know, you had the Scarlet Witch and the Agatha Witch throwing magic at each other, which